previous efforts to focus specifically on blacks have been often thwarted by pivoting the conversation in the direction of being more quote-unquote diverse and or more quote-unquote inclusive. Somehow those words seem relatively safe, and it's easier to talk about than words like quote-unquote race or quote-unquote Black Lives Matter. The use of the safe words is often justified by saying that it points to the overall commitment to quote-unquote everybody rather than to blacks. Now, what is not said is that the use of those safe words does not point to nor acknowledge the current call to support the tenets of recognizing and rectifying the centuries-old harm that has occurred to black Americans and the impact of the systems and structures that supported those occurrences on our entire nation, indeed on the entire world. The use of the quote-unquote safe words keeps the conversation quiet, non-confrontational, silences most of the affected voices as long as the numbers are right. Goals achieved are substantiated by sometimes objective data reports based on some planning document that was drafted most often without the involvement of a great majority of the very people that are quote-unquote diverse. And we hear terms such as managing diversity. Think about that for a while. Managing diversity. And just let that little phrase sort of sit on you for a while, okay? Because almost always in most environments, there's usually the person of color or the black person who tends to be the most vocal about issues of quote-unquote diversity, since that's the word that they've been given to use. And these people are often branded after they've done that. I mean, by branded, I mean they've been considered to be almost troublemakers, really. They sort of get in the way of the status quo. And so they're considered like troublemakers, you know. Everything is fine here. Why are you trying to shake things up now? And so people who are placed in these positions in the workforce now are now finding themselves with the expectation and the burden that they're going to be able to address all the quote-unquote diversity issues in the institution without causing too many waves, and the measure of success being how well everybody just sort of gets along. This is all reflective of the structures and processes that ultimately silence open discussions of race and specifically of blacks within that context. It supports the racism by keeping everything calm on the surface while the oppression continues. Systems of oppression are detrimental to both the oppressors and the oppressed. Those systems have spilled over into all aspects of life here in the USA, and a failure to recognize that reality and to dismantle the systems is akin to accepting them and to perpetuating the status quo. Failure to recognize those systems does not stop their existence. Failure to recognize those systems does not mean those systems do not exist. Failure to recognize those systems does not mean that those systems are not privileging one group over another. Does not mean that at all. But failure to dismantle those systems will perpetuate the harm for centuries in the future. We cannot let that happen. Systems of oppression are detrimental to both the oppressors and the oppressed. Those systems have spilled over to all aspects of life here in the USA, and a failure to recognize that reality and to dismantle the systems is akin to accepting them and to perpetuating the status quo. Failure to recognize those systems does not stop their existence. Let me repeat that. But failure to dismantle those systems will perpetuate the harm. Let me give you some examples here. The COVID-19 pandemic was determined to take the lives of blacks at a rate disproportionate to the population, leading to a deeper examination and acknowledgement of the underlying systems and structures that led to and supported the reality of lingering disparities in health, education, and socioeconomic status experienced by blacks across centuries. The acknowledgement of those disparities by a larger segment of the population has now demanded that something is done to dismantle the systems that perpetuate them. This is no easy task. As it has existed, it has grown, it has thrived, it has survived, it has privileged certain groups for over 400 years, often hidden from sight or not admitted to by those persons who will most likely gain privilege as a result of that reality. Often hidden from sight of those who perpetuated its existence intentionally or unintentionally. It's sort of clandestine, the way it crawls its way and permeates our society. Those who recognize and who dare to speak out against such disparities, who dare to speak out against racism, were often marginalized, became fearful. Sometimes their very life would be in danger. Sometimes they were in danger of losing family and friend relationships. But even more, they may be in danger of losing whatever pieces or vestiges of privileges that they may have had. Or they may have been relegated to the back rooms of unheeded scientific research or academic research, informed too often by the very systems that perpetuated the disparities. And so the disparities continue for 400 years until now. And what's happening now? Those disparities, those racial injustices, now threaten the general population. Now threaten the general population. Because those same laws and regulation and policies and practices and belief systems that were put in place intentionally to quote unquote keep black people in their place are now spilling over into other parts of the population. And that's why you hear the cry for, what about us? What about this? But you don't hear the cry for, let's go back and let's look and dismantle these systems that you and I both know were designed specifically to disadvantage blacks. Now, the world was made painfully aware of the systemic profiling of black Americans as a racial group in the United States. And remember, I said the world was made painfully aware of that. We've known this. We've worried about this. We've prayed about this for years. We've known it. We've taught our children about it. But the world was made painfully aware of the dangers of the systemic profiling of black Americans as a racial group in the United States, as we all watched the murder of George Floyd, Mr. George Floyd, in real time. We watched his life be deliberately taken away from him by a white man who showed no emotion on his face whatsoever, with his knee on the man's carotid artery, occluding the necessary life blood flow. We watched that as this man cried for help, called on his deceased mother's name. His deceased mother, Mama. We watched it in real time. We watched his life be taken from him in real time. We watched that minute by 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 minute. Until there was no life left. Until he took his last breath. Until the last exhale. And that breath traveled all over the world and sparked a movement that we have not experienced in our history. Why? This profiling is not new in the history of Black Americans in this country. It is not new in the history of blacks in many other countries. It is a reality that has spanned the past 400 years when the notion of the brutal killing of enslaved blacks became a legalized system informed by the declarations that blacks were not even considered to be humans, that we were considered to be property that could be bought and sold and traded and controlled, and that through it all we were indeed considered less than whites. Once that was institutionalized, that system, that belief system, backed up by laws and policies and I just can't name all the ways it was backed up. But that system progressed through the time of slavery, through the time of the Emancipation Proclamation, through the time of Reconstruction, through the time of the Jim Crow era, through the time of the Civil Rights era, through time boldly into today, And George Floyd's death was a bold manifestation of something that had been going on for too long. We could list names across that whole 400 years of people that have suffered under this system. The system is larger than racial profiling and disproportionate arrest and imprisonment and police brutality experienced by blacks in this USA. The system is filled with various underpinnings that were designed to keep blacks in their place. And those underpinnings have now spilled over into the realm of keeping other people in their place, particularly anybody that has anything, any persons of color being kept in their place. But failure to address the remnants of the systems and structures that underpin the oppression of blacks in this country is not an option anymore. We can't hide it under the guise of quote-unquote diversity and inclusion. We cannot sit quietly and ignore anti-black sentiments that are too often expressed in homes and in the communities, in where you shop, in your social gathering places. I'm talking to my white colleagues now. And those conversations that seem so general, so non-effective. Just think about it. When you feel, and I know you feel it, when you start to feel that little piece of discomfort deep down within you, telling you, this is not right. This is not right. It's time to speak up. It's time to be a part of the change. It is time to be this time on the right side of history. Because failure to address the remnants of the system's instruction that underpin the oppression of blacks in this country is not an option. Let me say it again. We cannot hide it under the guise of quote-unquote diversity and inclusion. We cannot sit quietly and ignore the anti-black sentiments that are springing forth in conversations that you too are privy to, and watch those conversations move from concept to reality. We cannot sit quietly and listen to denials that systems of oppression of blacks have existed and been supported for over 400 years. The very notion of freedom for blacks in this country was determined by law and strictly defined as to what freedom meant through the years. Freedom from slavery was coupled with the requirements that still kept us in our place. Freedom, who lived what? Who was truly free? Who actually got land? Who didn't? Who was to remain as sharecroppers? Where would we live? Where we could gather or meet? Masters and mistresses who still maintain control over the previously enslaved blacks on their plantations. Who won married? It was even decided what your race would be if you indeed had any drop of black blood, as they called it, in you. That meant that if you were quote unquote had 50-50, we'll call it. Let's just call it that, since everything starts out 50-50, right? No matter how that 50-50 occurred. If that 50-50 occurred as a result of rape, if that 50-50 occurred as a result of marriage, later on legal marriage, didn't matter. Because there is one thing for sure that you are not going to be called, and that was white. You might be called mixed, or you might be called black, or anything in between there, but definitely not white. Why is that? Because the system is set up to maintain the quote-unquote purity of the white race. But now is the time. Now is the time to move this country from its past into its future. Now is the time for everybody to think about this. Now is the time to make some decisions about which side of the fence do you stand on, and how can we all work together to move us from our past into our future. We know that has to occur. And really, it's been so long, it's so many years, that we've had time to think about this a lot. So I'm going to call upon all of you here to start to think about that now. Don't be afraid. Be ye not afraid. Be ye not afraid to make a positive difference. Be ye not afraid to be a part of history where you look at yourself and look at the people around you and start to think seriously about how can we dismantle this racism. And to my white colleagues, you cannot depend on us to be the people to handle all that. You have white privilege. You need to learn how to use it, and to use it to dismantle some of the racism that we know exists. You're going to have to learn how to use truth-telling. You're going to have to learn to know how to reconcile some of the things that you're struggling with right now. And I know that there are some people out there who would honestly rather see things not only remain the same, but would really like to see things really tighten up more so that there's even more racism than what we see now. And we got to call that into check. So I'm pleased that I see people all over the world standing together with a determination now to first acknowledge, just the acknowledgement of all that black people as a race have had to endure for over 400 years, to acknowledge that and to say we're standing with you now as we got to move forward now to dismantle that. So thank you for listening. This is just one in many in the series that we're doing on these conversations. We will have other guests who will come in and we'll be able to share with you what their thoughts are, what their experiences are. So until then, we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.